Good morning, actually afternoon now to all of you. Obviously very difficult times, and certainly hope that for those who are celebrating this week, a happy Passover and a happy Easter to you and yours, and may you stay safe and virtually connected. In good times and particularly in bad times, the Ontario Chamber of Commerce and its amazing network of local chambers and boards of trade across this province have one goal in mind, and that is to be your indispensable partner in success and in dealing with hardship. And so we seek very much to be your voice to government and to be able to provide you with ongoing information and services that are going to make a difference. Part of that offering is this series of webinars in this critical time to deal with a whole host of issues. And we're delighted today to be joined by our trusted members from Fragment to take on one of the key topics for those of us doing business across borders, with employees from across borders, how to function, what challenges, what are the practical how-to steps. We want to keep getting your input on what kinds of topics would be of interest in the future. And I'll talk more about what's coming up when we close off. But for now, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague and Senior Business Development Advisor, Brent Edwards, to introduce our guests.
Great, thank you so much, Rocco. We're so happy that you're able to join us, even though it's a difficult time for everyone in the province. We really want to provide value to our corporate members and members of the Ontario Chamber Network, and we're just delighted that a couple of immigration managers from our corporate member Fragment are able to join us today. I'm going to provide you with a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'd be happy to introduce Rick and Carly. So we're going to be accepting questions throughout the presentation. Rick and Carly will be going through their presentation first. What we're going to be doing is keeping everyone on mute for the balance of the presentation, but we would ask you to go to the chat box, which you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'd ask you to type in whatever question you'd like to ask around the issues of immigration and mobility. And then once the presentation is finished, we'll be happy to try to go through as many questions as we possibly can. So everyone's going to be remaining on mute mode for the balance of the presentation. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers for today. So we have Rick LaMotta, who's joining us. He has practiced exclusively in the area of Canadian corporate immigration law since being called to the Law Society of Ontario and the Bar in 2006. So he's currently a senior business immigration manager at Fragment, which is the world's largest immigration services provider. Rick's expertise spans temporary and permanent immigration categories, provincial programs, immigration compliance, and policy. He's been invited to speak at numerous conferences, seminars, and industry events. And in 2017, Rick was designated by the Law Society of Ontario as a certified specialist in immigration and citizenship law. And in 2018, he became a member of the Law Society of Alberta, where he resided for close to 2 years before moving back to Toronto. So welcome, Rick. Rick's joined by his colleague, Carly Robin. So Carly is a manager at Fragment's Toronto office, and there she assists clients with a wide range of US immigration matters, including non-immigrant visas, permanent residence, and citizenship. She's currently assisting corporate and individual clients with US consular applications to the Americas, as well as border applications into the US from Canada and Mexico. Before relocating to Canada, Carly served as an associate at Fragment's office in New York. Prior to joining Fragment, she practiced at a large law firm in New York. She also served as a clerk to Justice McLaughlin of the Connecticut Supreme Court in Hartford. And while in law school, Carly served as a member of the Fordham Law Review and the Immigration Advocacy Project. So help me welcome both Rick and Carly. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Brent. I appreciate that. A very nice intro. I guess I got to shave back my intro. It's a bit too long, I think. Thanks so much for that, and thank you, Rocco, and thank you everyone at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce for having us. the last few weeks, I'm sure for everyone, has been sort of this weird upside down world, and what we do in immigration has been no different. Every single day, it seems as though additional guidance and policy directives are issued, revamped, revised, updated. So it's been a very long slog. As I was saying to a friend of mine the other day, I said, I've never worked this hard and this long for so little revenue. But it is what it is, and I'm sure we are in the same boat as many other individuals, companies, industries, and so certainly there's some commonality there. And so hopefully today we will be able to provide you with some guidance, some updates, answer any questions you have, and provide you with a snapshot as to the landscape as it currently stands here in Canada. And so with that, we will get started. So as this lovely patriotic flag might suggest, we'll start on the Canadian side. And I'd just like to, first, I want to set the scene for you. And so by that, what I mean is, if we go back about, 3-4 weeks ago to March 16th, where the announcement was made that I remember seeing on CBC, CTV, Canada border closed, the longest, freestanding border on, a free border anywhere in the world. It's closed down for business. Well, that's not exactly true. And I think, those details came out shortly thereafter. And so as it stands right now, this list right here, which is not exhaustive, but which does cover most groups of people, these are the folks who are allowed into the country. And keep in mind, you must be asymptomatic. The only people who are able to enter the country who are symptomatic are those who are Canadian citizens and permanent residents. And that's only if they arrive by way of land crossing. And that's because they are able to do so by right, but they are not able to do so, by plane or train or any other commercial carrier. And we'll get to that in a minute. So basically, this is the general rule of thumb. If you are symptomatic, you're not coming in. Doesn't matter how, from where, whatever it is, unless you're a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. Those coming for work purposes, those who hold work permits, those who were approved for a work permit on or before March 18th, those people can enter. And we'll get to that as well. The various layers of government means that we've had varying policy directives issued. So in this case, whether it's the Canada Border Services Agency, whether it's Health Canada, whether it's Immigration Canada, all three of these layers and others have been, publishing various guidance. And so, normally this type of policy guidance comes out over a period of months, if not longer. And yet here, what we're finding is that, the civil servants are being required to issue directives in a matter of days. And so while it's easy to criticize and say, well, I'm sure you didn't mean this, so you have to edit it. Why are you guys using this terminology here? It's very difficult because these things, like I said, usually take months to put together, especially in cases where you have so many different ministries involved where the primary focus is health. So with that in mind, they're trying to coordinate as best they can in order to issue policy that is grounded in, a logical sort of thinking, and while not being too wide, not catching too wide a net. Study permit holders can enter the country. Those who were approved on or before March 18th are also able to enter. Those who are approved of permanent resident status. And this one is very interesting. This one caused a lot of conversation in our world, which is foreign nationals with immediate family members legally residing in Canada. So 2 parts. One, immediate family members has been redefined until June 30th. They now include parents and step-parents. So one's immediate family members are no longer just spouses and dependent children. They also include parents and step-parents. That is effective until June 30th. And that's important because, again, the government did that because normally in the last few years, what we've had is the parents and grandparents draw for permanent residence. Well, that's not taking place this year. And this was essentially the federal government's way to backdoor people getting their parents here, if possible, if they're eligible to do so. So that's who can come in. Now we'll look at sort of some restrictions. Restrictions are both inbound and domestic. Domestic really only applies to those who are symptomatic. However, in terms of a practical, point, you can expect longer times, maybe perhaps some delays in order to board a flight or board a train, assuming, of course, that is still an option for us, down the line. And, so we'll have to wait and see. More importantly for this presentation, though, so where we are, where people are barred entry, regardless of whether they're symptomatic or not, non-essential travel now is barred. So anyone coming to Canada unless they're exempt in the last slide there, you are not allowed to enter Canada if your purpose is not to do one of the things we already mentioned, which is work, study, or join a family member. So non-essential reasons banned. Additionally, there's medical pre-screening in place, which I'm sure many people have seen on the news. All incoming and domestic flights or trains, any symptomatic passengers are denied boarding. Face a 14-day ban. The only way you can overcome that ban is if you show a letter from a doctor stating that you are actually clear of any COVID-19 related symptoms. The medical screening also takes place at all the land crossings, and like I said, the only ones who can enter, if they are symptomatic, would be Canadian citizens and permanent residents, and even then, they are then immediately ushered to further medical personnel to receive treatment and otherwise. If you're entering the U.S., you must physically and exclusively have been present there or Canada for 14 days prior to entry. And this one's very maybe peculiar to some people. Again, as I was mentioning before about the speed and the rapid issuance of the policy guidance, this particular policy was implemented, I think, right on March 16th. So right at the introduction of the pandemic here in Canada. Now, some might say, wait a second, the numbers in the U.S. are skyrocketing. Why would we want someone to be in the U.S. for 14 days prior to coming to Canada? And it's a very good question. But that is what it is, and we expect that might change, even though it was just implemented 3 weeks ago, right? Such as the sort of enormity of what we're dealing with and the fluidity of the situation ahead. All incoming flights to Canada, except for those coming from the U.S., Mexico, and the Caribbean, they're landing in only one of 4 airports. So Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver. They're doing that so that they can better medically screen everyone upon arrival, and they have very tight controls over the border crossings, at least at the international airports. The last point here, I place these here for anyone. They're actually very helpful. What it does is it goes over it's a 2-step process. Now, keep in mind, as part of this, essentially airlines are now responsible for doing a lot of things they're not usually used to doing. Essentially, the federal government has farmed this out to them, which is why now Transport Canada has issued these very helpful decision trees. These are particular to flights, but you'll see how the airline goes about the process of determining who is or is not allowed to board a flight, based on whether it's coming from the United States or from Canada, because there are different rules. So I do suggest you go look there if you're interested in that, or you know of anyone who needs to fly in. Please direct them there. They're very helpful. And again, that came after weeks of various discussions in terms of, well, who can board? Did you really mean to say that this person isn't allowed and that person is, and so on and so forth? But at this point right now, they're accurate and they're fairly logical and they are helpful. So I invite you to go check those out. One point I wanted to make, as I'm sure all of us are aware, with regard to mandatory self-isolation. So this applies to every single person entering the country, regardless of citizenship, and with very narrow exceptions, which I will get to. So the mandatory 14-day isolation period, okay, regardless of initial symptoms. Now, the critical part about that is it's not self-isolation as perhaps we on this call might know it. For example, if you had to, you could walk outside and go get your groceries. Social distancing requires you to do so, 2 meters away from anyone around you. But in these terms, what it means is you don't leave your house. You order your food in, you order your groceries in, you do not leave your house for 14 days. And in addition, you are not allowed to take, for example, public transit where you're going. So when you get to the airport, you take private carrier or Uber or whatever, taxi, to get to wherever it is you're going. The next point, as you'll see, makes it very clear. all foreign nationals coming to Canada are required to show an isolation plan. So that is to say, if you hold a work permit, you're coming in to work for your employer has to realize that you are not allowed to just begin work unless you are exempt. And again, we'll talk about those in a moment. But you are not only required to self-isolate for 14 days, you must convince an officer that A, you are aware of that, and B, well, tell them how you're going to do it. Have you realized? Do you have any groceries in the fridge? How are you going to get those? Have you arranged for anything? And so the employer needs to understand that. And while this is fairly new, this only came out earlier this week. So there isn't any specific guidance on what employers are required to say. But the absence of a plan, it's very clear, absence of a plan may result in refusal to enter. The government's word is, if you do not yet have a plan, we recommend you delay your travel, as if to say, you're not coming in until you can prove to us that you understand what's going on here. So that's just something to keep in mind. As we all probably have heard on the news, very significant fines for those who break this law and who don't abide by the rules. Now, here where the exemptions come in. And this is, I'm sure we'll have some questions on these later. The exemption applies to those providing essential services. Now, essential services is a very hot topic in immigration law. What does it mean? Who falls under the umbrella? Further guidance has been issued piecemeal over the last few days and a couple weeks. What we do know for sure right now, truck drivers regularly crossing to maintain the flow of critical goods are exempt. Medical service providers are exempt, and healthcare professionals are exempt. And I added a link here for anyone who wants to look at it to take a look and see exactly who is deemed to be exempt. But those three categories for sure are exempt. You have to keep in mind that while all this guidance is being produced, at the end of the day, it's the opinion of a CBSA officer upon arrival, whether at a land crossing or an airport, who has the authority to make the decision. For whatever reason, he or she feels they want to make it. Now, of course, one can go to a superintendent, and superintendent get involved, but keep in mind there as well, superintendents are generally hesitant to overrule the opinion of their officer, especially if an argument can be made as to why that decision, was handed down. So, I mean, I guess the next point, I guess, encapsulates it, which is to say, call ahead, call your immigration representative if you have one, call us if you don't, call the port of entry where you're going to be landing, call the airline retaining flight, just be proactive. It's very critical to be proactive because there's a lot of guidance out there, and I can tell you, there are immigration lawyers across this country who've been practicing for decades, who, it's confusing for a lot of people. This is not easy stuff, and so the best way to protect yourself is to call ahead and try your best to get guidance so you're not left disappointed or frustrated, having made a trip or gotten ready or doing all these things only to be told no, you can't come in, or no, you can't work for 2 weeks. I mean, this self-isolation plan, the employers have to pay the employee up to 30 hours a week to not work for 2 weeks. It includes agriculture workers. It includes processing plants. So it's a wide swath of the economy. And so I think perhaps what's happening right now is I'm on a few different committees, and I can tell you that conversations are taking place as to why certain groups need to be exempted from this. The critical result of what will happen if people come in and have to sit down for 2 weeks, food supplies, things like that. So, while this is a snapshot of what it is today, do not be surprised if this changes by the day, by the week, and so on and so forth. So with all that, I thought I might sort of, just go over some general points with the audience now in an effort to try to, talk about things that you might want to be thinking about in your own business. So entry strategies and of course the big topic, which is, well, what do we do with the foreign workers we have here? So let's start with the first. So for those who have foreign nationals outside the country who currently work for them and who want to have enter, or those who are thinking of hiring foreign nationals to come into Canada, what this all means. So, visa offices around the world, much like offices here in Canada, Service Canada offices, inland immigration offices, are either closed or working at minimal capacity. That said, Immigration Canada continues to receive applications. They are strongly recommending people to file online if you're a new applicant for a visitor record, a work permit, a study permit, and so forth. So they are accepting applications. Now, what we recommended our clients do is, look, if you know that you have people you're going to need in Canada in the near to medium term once this all dies down, there is no point in waiting to file these applications. Get them in the queue now, because there could be delays in the back end. I mean, the backlog could be significant. So your best bet is to say, okay, well, we might not do this for all the people that we thought we might hire, but certainly we know we're going to need a certain number. Let's get those certain number in the queue. The government has also said that no application be refused for the inability to obtain documentation during the pandemic. They've increased the time by which one can submit things like biometrics, which are essentially eye scans and fingerprints, obtaining documents, passport submissions, because some of those passports may expire. Some people may not be able to mail their passports securely. So there's all these different factors. So the government has been, credit where it's due, the government's been very flexible in terms of, explaining to people, look, that keep filing your applications if you need to. It's okay. We might not get to it right away, but don't worry, you will not be refused if you cannot submit a certain document that is required as a next step. They'll give you the time to do that, but at least you get it in the queue. We were talking about essential. How do I prove a job and or foreign national is essential? I think this is a critical point. In our experience, where the industry or the occupation perhaps does not fall in line with what might be deemed essential, a medical service provider, a truck driver who crosses every day. One suggestion I might give you would be, look at the economic impacts of the job itself, and in addition, try to outline the resulting impact if the person is not allowed to enter. It's very critical, because by doing that, you show an officer, look, if I can't come here, here's the results. The result could be, layoffs. The result could be a company not being able to fulfill a contract, which could then result in a negative economic outcome, which then naturally might impact current employees, Canadians, and otherwise. So, that's something that we mentioned in order to, A, get the work permit, and B, try to avoid the mandatory isolation. But people have to keep in mind that at this point, if you have someone who does not have a work permit or work permit approval, two things. That person can only file their application upon entering Canada if they arrive directly from the United States. And two, you'll have to do a very good job of convincing an officer at a land border or airport as to why they should be given a work permit in this current landscape. So I would suggest that the 14-day isolation period might be secondary, in terms of just getting a person in and getting a work permit. I think in this landscape, everything we're seeing and hearing, give yourself a pat on the back, because it's not easy right now. We're seeing some things that are very curious, which were to be anticipated, but we're curious nonetheless. Lastly, I'll just provide a few points here regarding your foreign worker population in Canada. So a few things. Can people work from home? Well, yes and no. The yes is no is because normally you can't. However, in this day and age, in the situation in which we find ourselves, as long as the individual is doing the work they were supposed to be doing, as long as they're being paid and provide the benefits they were supposed to be paid and provided, and as long as their home happens to be in the same general geographic area as the job itself. Now the government hasn't put any sort of distance requirements on it, but again, common sense would dictate that. I find it very, very, very hard to believe that, a year from now, if a company was audited and someone said, well, I was working at home for 6 months or 3 months because of this pandemic, I don't think an officer is going to really do much. And if they did, then, well, give me a call. And I would definitely love to have that discussion with an officer. Layoffs and furloughs is a very, very big topic for obvious reasons. Now, in this case, what we do suggest is that the simple answer is no, that foreign workers should not be provided any benefits or wages that do not meet what was agreed to or what was submitted upon entering Canada. However, excuse me, there are situations, there are carve-outs, but there is legislation that suggests that a company can make the argument, and I believe the exact wording is dramatic changes in the economy. I would argue that this falls right in line with a dramatic change in the economy. In fact, I don't think they have the words to describe what this has done to the economy. So for the time being, let's just say that there is a way for employers to justify the change in the salary and working conditions of a foreign worker. Now, important to note, though, and this is very critical, that in that same vein, foreign workers cannot be targeted for those changes. So what that means is this. Let's say you have a company of 100 people. And let's say at that company, you have 15 foreign workers. Now, if you were to lay off 30 people and 15 were foreign workers, you can make an argument and say, well, half the people we had to, we laid off half of our foreign worker base is gone, but so too are 15 other Canadians. So, that there's an argument to be made. If you only lay off, let's say, 17 people and all 15 of your foreign workers are now gone, you'll have a different, a much harder time to convince an officer that this decision didn't disproportionately impact foreign workers at your company. So again, the advice here would be keep all the documentation you have, make records and keep records of everything, so that when the time comes, if the time comes, you have the documents you need to show an officer, look, we were reasonable. We tried to keep as many people employed as we could for as long as we could. And we certainly didn't target these individuals. They were just fell under the umbrella, right? Whether it's based on their occupation, whether it's based on their seniority, whatever it might be based on, but it cannot significantly or disproportionately rather target a foreign national. So that would also apply to reduction, salary, hours, benefits. It's all under the same umbrella. So keep in mind, while technically you're not allowed to do it, there are ways you can explain why you did do it. The current situation would fall right in line with one of the reasons why one could do it, but doing so, it has to be even across the board. Okay, so if you're going to do that with a foreign worker, it can't just be foreign workers. It has to be your entire population of employees. Can a foreign national stranded here who can't return home work in Canada? Well, no. An individual needs to have a work permit, and that work permit needs to allow that person to work at a specific company. So if the individual does not hold an open work permit, then no. If they hold an employer-specific work permit that has the name of another employer, then no, they can't. On that point, what I would suggest is if anyone on the call has a foreign worker population, and you're thinking about, well, how can I extend these people, or should I extend these people? Yes, extend the people if they're expiring within the next 6 months. I would get that started right now, because again, those offices too are working very limited staffing levels, and so processing times are already starting to increase, and they will only continue to increase while the pandemic drags on and while people are working from home for the most part. So it's prudent to do that. Now obviously we say, well, I don't know if I can need this person 6 months. That's fine, you can wait. But this applies for people you're going to need. Your critical employees, regardless of whether it's due to their what they do or their knowledge base or the seniority or whatever it might be. Just sort of now's the time where you want to take a look and say, target those who are critical to your organization, and do what you have to do to keep them or get them here. And that's where your representative can help with that. And lastly, I'll just go this because this applies to everyone. Can employees who need to travel to another country do so? Well, yeah, except they have to get back in. So no one's ever, you're always allowed to leave if you can find a flight, right? There are no exit, restrictions right now in Canada, as there are in some other countries around the world. But at this point right now, we are not at a point where it's complete lockdown. So if you're able to find a flight to leave, presumably you can do so, as long as you're not in the self-isolation period, right? That's critical. If you're in self-isolation, you can't leave your house, then yes, you can leave. However, a bar to reentry may apply. So again, keep in mind, it's not good enough to think, oh, well, I can leave whenever I want. Well, now you got to think, well, will they let me back in? And so that will depend on your own specific set of circumstances. So I think I've talked for quite a while. I apologize for that. And to be honest, a lot of this just scratches the surface. There's each individual area that does come with it its own branch, so to speak, of conversation. But I hope that's been helpful. At this point right now, what I'll do as the this beautiful patriotic flag would suggest, is I will hand it over to my colleague Carly. Carly's a manager who handles our U.S. immigration team at Fragment in Toronto. So Carly, I will give you the next slide and just let me know when you want me to switch them over. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. So with respect to entry into the United States from Canada, as we all know, the land border between the US and Canada is closed to non-essential traffic until at least April 20th, which is only 11 days away. So this will likely be extended longer. Non-essential traffic is defined as travel for tourism or recreation. And essential travel includes but is not limited to U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, or green card holders as they're known, from returning to the United States. Individuals engaged in lawful cross-border trade, such as truck drivers carrying cargo. Individuals traveling to work in the United States, among others. So as written, the guidance should include employment-based non-immigrant visa holders, and it should allow for work visa holders to re-enter the U.S. as they are considered essential. But that said, if we go on to the next slide, the question is, what is really happening at the U.S. land borders? U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers, or CBP officers as they're known, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, at land border ports of entry, they do appear to be accepting new visa applications and also readmitting those individuals already granted employment-based non-immigrant visa status. And we have recently, in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks or so, have had employment visa holders successfully re-enter the U.S. at land border crossings, including Peace Bridge by Buffalo, Jackman, Maine. We did have some in Pembina, North Dakota, and I have had some individuals cross at Detroit. That said, we all have also seen CBP officers turn away people, including at the Detroit port of entry. So I've had both successful reports and also people who are refused entry. So the land border crossings are sort of a mixed bag at this point. We have also had folks who are denied entry by certain officers because they were told, oh, you're not in healthcare. And that really is not consistent with the guidance as written. But to the extent that CBP officers are saying that they get to decide what essential travel is, that's an implementation problem. The officers themselves might not have realized that trade and business are supposed to remain intact. That's actually in the White House press releases and rules. The White House briefing statements actually says trade and business travel will continue to operate across the borders, ensuring workers and goods are not impeded. However, there's always a risk with new rules in particular and individual officers, and it does take time for CBP headquarters to ensure that all the supervisors at all ports of entry are updated and trained, and for the more junior officers to be trained accordingly. CBP officers, apart from coronavirus, they can be, generally they can be wild cards, and so this is especially true when you have a new set of rules that come out. CBP officers have a good amount of discretion, but there's not really any more discretion than normal. The issue is really just that the implementation of the guidelines on non-essential traffic is presenting problems, and it's almost impossible to challenge on the ground. So we have had people, call ahead. They'll call the port of entry. We'll call on their behalf on, for example, Monday, we called ahead and we said, this individual is coming down to apply for an employment visa. And can you confirm that you are willing to accept this and review the application? An officer says yes. They get in their car. The next morning, they drive down. They get a different officer, and that officer says no, it's not an essential service, which again is not part of the guidance, but the officers do have a lot of discretion, and the person was then turned away. So I would encourage everyone to, as Rick was saying, be proactive and call ahead and have an attorney represent them to the extent that you're able to do so, because we are still seeing encountering officers who sort of are inconsistent. So that's what's happening at the land borders. And if we turn to the next slide, just keep in mind that air travel is actually exempt from the essential travel restrictions. So you can still travel via air between Canada and the US, and international commercial flight options do exist, though they are hard to find. Right now, all pre-clearance locations in Canada are open and continuing to adjudicate employment visas, including L1 visas and TNs. And in fact, both Toronto Pearson Airport and Pre-Flight Inspection in Winnipeg have both confirmed that they are, quote, business as usual. So I have had a couple of clients who have decided to just simply fly out of Pearson, and thus far, fingers crossed, we have not actually had issues. So if you do plan on sending someone to the US and air travel is an option for them, that's something that you may wish to consider. As for US consulates, all the US consulates globally have canceled routine visa appointments. We believe through approximately the end of April, though it does vary a bit depending on the particular consulate. On March 20th, the US State Department announced that it has suspended routine visa services at all embassies and consulates, including those in Canada. So this includes non-immigrant visas, immigrant visas or green card applications, American citizen services. All of those routine services have been suspended until at least April 30th. State Department has not provided a date by which they will resume routine services. But right now, consular officers are only providing emergency services. And for those folks who believe that they actually do have an emergency, we can always try and request an emergency appointment on your behalf. Just keep in mind, it's very difficult to get approved. We have had success in particular cases, for example, where staff or particular medical staff or pharmaceutical company employees were actually coming to the US to provide medical services or to work on some sort of research for COVID-19. And also for family reunification, in particularly dire instances, we have had emergency appointments be approved. For those applicants whose appointments at the US consulates were canceled, we are sometimes able to reschedule the appointment for a future date. So it depends on whether or not your person is a Canadian resident or not. Canadian residents were able to rebook an appointment for around July or August, but for non-Canadian residents, meaning third country nationals or TCNs as they're called, generally meaning non-American and non-Canadian residents, for those individuals, we don't have any availability at any US consulate throughout Canada. They continue to remain completely booked, and we think that that will be the case until around the fall. So that's it on the US front. So I will push this back to you, Brent.
Oh, thanks so much, Carly, and to you and Rick in terms of answering a lot of the questions. We did have some questions from the audience, so let's go through those now. The first question is related to university students, in particular international students. So Erica Cutter has asked, is there information available on 14 days mandatory quarantine for international students? They are visiting Canada first time and most of them have no place to stay. University residences are not prepared for this kind of service. Does the CBSA, are they preparing rooms for those foreign citizens with study and work permit, which have no possibility to self-isolate? How can we make sure that foreign persons entering the country will follow the instructions and will not show up at the university?
It's a good question. There's a few layers to that. I appreciate that question. Thank you for asking. So this time, what the guidance says is this. It's not good enough to simply have a work permit or have a study permit. The person needs to be entering to work and hold a work permit or work permit approval. Or, in the case of a student, the student needs to be studying and hold a study permit to do so. So, unfortunately, at this time, that mandatory self-isolation rule is in effect. And in fact, what I was mentioning earlier about the published guidance online saying, if you don't have a plan to isolate, we recommend you delay your travel. That applies to students as well. So for students who, for example, who need to come to attend class, then they will be required to show some kind of plan as to how they will isolate. My suggestion would be, and again, it's a lot of this is being downloaded onto departments, onto groups, organizations that have no experience in this. They're not ready for this type of requirement. And so the short answer is, unfortunately, it does apply to everyone. Now, what I can say also for students, just recently the government announced that if a student's course or a course of study or program is moving online and that individual is not able to travel to Canada for whatever the reason, or need not come to Canada to attend any classes, that individual can undertake those classes online, and it will not impact their ability to eventually obtain a postgraduate work permit. So take, for example, a student who would have been coming into Canada, to Ontario, to study a 2-year, to take part in a 2-year program. And let's just say that program was to start in June or May, because right now the guidance only assumes that those are the 2 starting points. They have not yet gone to September as yet, but we will see how this all develops. But for the time being, if someone were to start school in June and the school were to say, sorry, all the classes are now online, then that individual can study remotely from wherever they're from, and it will not impact their ability to get a postgraduate work permit upon graduation or any of those sorts of things. So they are trying in a way to have as little impact as possible. But to answer the specific question, the mandatory self-isolation period applies to everyone. As I was saying, things have turned on their head. Public health, the Ministry of Health is essentially, I wouldn't say calling the shots, but essentially this is the baseline, and now everyone else has to work around that baseline. And that baseline is you enter Canada and you immediately self-isolate for 14 days with those very narrow exemptions that I alluded to earlier on. So I hate being the bearer of bad news, but I mean, it's accurate. But that's something that I would imagine the student will be calling the school about. And, I'm sure that many schools are in the same boat. I'm not that linked in with the sort of the industry association for colleges and universities in Ontario, but these conversations are taking place. And if anyone has any questions about that, I'd be happy to engage and provide suggestions or at least some feedback.
Thanks very much, Rick. Yeah, there's given the number of international students in Canada and in Ontario in particular, it's a really important question. So there's another question from Dharmesh Patel, again related to international students. And the question is there anything being done to lift the cap of 20 hours per week for international students, as they may be an ideal source for greenhouse sector with limited migrant workers available?
So what the government has said in that respect is no. So if a student was able to work up to 20 hours a week prior, they can still work up to 20 hours per week prior off campus based on their study permit. And just for those that don't know, anyone holding a study permit is automatically eligible to work up to 20 hours per week off campus, provided their study permit has that notation, and 40 hours full-time work when school is regularly out of session. So think, March break, December break, summer holidays, those sorts of things. So generally that's when schools are out of session. Obviously in this day and age, not everyone studies from September to April. So there are different anomalies there, and those are accounted for as well. But the answer is no. A student cannot just start to work full-time now because their courses are online. They're still only allowed to work 20 hours a week now. That said, we are sitting here in the middle of April, and so the normal school year will be ending shortly. And so at that point in time, then students would be able to work their full-time hours when school is out of session.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question related to, again, with the students, and it's, are the universities responsible to accommodate the students with rooms for self-isolation?
That's a good question. No specific guidance is provided in that respect. But the student needs to have a plan. So, it does leave a bit of a gap, doesn't it? And so there's no specific guidance that I'm aware of that's been provided by government as yet with respect to how schools fit into this requirement. I guess, again, like I said, policies are being crafted literally within hours. And, they're not really fully, in some cases, they just don't think about it. In other cases, they just say, too bad, so sad. And I don't mean to sound crude about it, but that's essentially what is apparently happening here. Now that said, as days and weeks go by, there might be further guidance, there might be further, assistance in that regard to various institutions that are, probably thinking, well, what do we have to do here? Do we have to put them up? And it's a residence setting. I live in residence. I mean, many people live in residence. It's hard to stay 2 meters away from someone and stay in their room. So again, the government hasn't really provided any direction in that respect as to what the school's responsibility is to help a student self-isolate. But it's very clear that the student will need to provide something cogent to convince an officer that yes, they in fact can and will self-isolate for 14 days after arrival.
Got it. Okay.
Sorry, I feel terrible. Brent, give me something I have some good news on.
No, but we have you and Carly on the call because of candor and giving us the truth in terms of.
Yeah. Okay. Well, fair enough. Fair enough.
Absolutely. So we have a question here from a Caroline fan. Caroline's asking if a foreign worker can benefit from either EI or the CERB.
That's a good question. Right now, or at least the normal courses that know, a foreign worker holding a permit that was employer specific means that employer or that employee can only work for that company. So part of getting EI was, well, no, you have to be able to work on a moment's notice. And so because the work permit that person held precluded them from doing so, they in fact were not eligible for EI benefits. Now, at this point in time, those rules are changing quite frequently. They're being updated as we speak. Anybody who watches CBC every day or CTV or whatever, you will see these press conferences every day, whether it's, the stimulus package increasing, what it includes, can businesses sort of pull from this? What can they get? What are they eligible for? My suggestion is this: the temporary foreign worker program, they've just issued an FAQ. You might want to take a look at that for your foreign workers just to see what in fact they are eligible for, because this is a hot topic right now. And again, it wasn't, immigration as much as, my world might be consumed with it, his world might be consumed with it. At the end of the day, this forms just a piece of a very, very large bucket, if you will, policies, procedures, guidance, concerns that the government has, health being the biggest one. To answer the question, my suggestion would be, I would suggest looking at the temporary foreign worker program guidelines, specifically maybe even Employment Social Development Canada, to see what in fact any worker might be eligible for. There may be time constraints on it, as in how long do we work in the country, how much have you paid in. But all these things might factor in. So my answer would be, you want to take a look at that particular website, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, the TFWP, or Employment Social Development Canada, which is ESDC. Those are the two streams that one can retain a work permit, whether they they require a labor market impact assessment or they don't. The Immigration Mobility Program, all these areas would be areas that you want to specifically focus on to determine whether or not any specific foreign worker can, apply for and be eligible for the CERB or EI benefits, because that's just changing by the day.
Thanks, Rick. So we're going to probably have room for, I think, one or two more questions. So there was another question here related to temporary foreign workers, and that was related to if there was still processing work permits for temporary foreign workers if they applied 4 months ago. Is there a significant delay?
Sorry, Brett, could you repeat that? I didn't get all that.
Sure, sorry. So are there still work permits for temporary foreign workers still being processed if they applied months ago?
Yes. So yes, what's happening is this. So the government has said they are still processing applications. Now, in what order is a bit of a black hole. We don't know. Some offices come back saying, "Look, we're only providing emergency services at this point." My suggestion would be, now it depends on what stage that application is at. So, for instance, if the person applied at a consulate, if they're outside Canada and they applied at a consulate, for a work permit that did not require a labor market impact assessment, or if that labor market impact assessment was in fact approved and submitted along with a work permit application, what I might suggest is contacting the visa office, you know, A, to get a status update, and B, to reiterate or reinforce, or if doing so for the first time, explaining and outlining why the job is critical in Canada, why that job is needed here right now. I would also, like I said, include the fact that the mandatory self-isolation period is acknowledged. You know, I would do that if an application is already in process and that's the thing. You can be sure that, you know, it may not be getting the top priority at this time. So you might want to have that hopefully nudged along by providing some additional information and outlining why that job now all of a sudden now needs to take place. Especially in light of, and again, I'm not saying anyone doesn't know, but especially in light of the current economic landscape we're in, you know, we anticipate seeing some changes to a lot of the, you know, programs and worker streams that we are so accustomed and used to. These could change on a dime. I think the dust has nowhere near settled on this, and so to answer that question, they should still be in process. But you might want to nudge it along by, you know, providing some additional information that may not have been highlighted in the initial application.
Great. Okay, thanks, Rick. So one other question. Do you have any clarification if those under International Experience Canada, IEC, are exempt from the travel restrictions of non-residents, non-Canadians coming to Canada during this time?
So if someone holds a work permit or a work permit approval letter under the IEC, here's an important factor. So the IEC, it depends on, there's different streams. There's working holiday, young professionals, and so there's different sort of buckets within the IEC. If someone obtained approval for an IEC-based work permit prior to or on or before March 18th, then it is incumbent upon that person, along with the other factors we mentioned, self-isolation and otherwise, that they can show they actually have a job here. Again, let's go back to the main premise. The person must be working and hold a work permit. That's what the guidance says. So there is a line of thought that suggests that an officer has every right to refuse someone entry if, in fact, they don't have an actual job they're coming to, right? So it's not going to say, yeah, well, I applied for this program. I was going to go plant trees. I was going to figure it out when I got here. I didn't require it. I didn't have to have an offer of employment to get this ability to work. That's true. They didn't. However, it's a different sort of landscape, right? And so an officer, what we're hearing is officers are asking, well, show me proof you have a job. In some cases, an officer might say, well, tell me how that job is essential, which I think is not the correct analysis to undertake. I don't think it's necessary to do that just based on the guidance. But at the very least, an individual on an IEC-based work permit approval or IEC-based work permit will need to show that they actually have a job lined up somewhere and they're able to self-isolate before taking that job on.
Wow. Thank you so much, Rick and Carly, for covering a lot of territory. There's still some questions that we weren't able to answer, but we're going to be providing those to you to answer offline. Really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. What I want to do is thank everyone for attending today, and want to have our CEO and President of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, Rocco Rossi, make some important closing remarks. Over to you, Rocco.
Thanks so much, Brent, and thank you, Carly, and your sidekick, Rick, for an illuminating discussion and willingness to take more questions via email. I want to thank all of you for joining us. We want to make these more and more useful for you. Write us, call us with ideas for other webinars that are of importance to you. Let us know. Give us your email if you want us to keep you posted on upcoming ones. We will be putting these webinars and the recordings online. Next week, Tuesday, phenomenal webinar lined up. Return of our friends from MNP together with the Royal Bank and Meridian to talk about the different credit expansion and loan offers made by the government, take you through that process in a real practical how-to. So join us on Tuesday. Make sure you register for that. That invitation is out and it's available on our social media channels. Again, happy Passover, happy Easter to those celebrating. To the rest, stay safe, stay healthy. We're going to beat this together. Thank you.